Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. Today we talk about child well-being in New Mexico. We also will discuss early childhood education and how that is being conducted in our area and in rural parts of the state. Joining us is Sylvia Ulloa from New Mexico In Depth. Sylvia, you've been covering this issue all year long. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Now, a judge ruled in New Mexico that the state wasn't doing enough to meet its constitutional requirements to provide an adequate education for students who are at risk. Can we talk a little bit about what that ruling did to really kind of get the ball moving in addressing the issue of child well-being and also early childhood education?
Well, I think that what was very specific about that ruling was that the judge is saying that New Mexico is not doing we have a bad rep as it is on educating our children in New Mexico. We're ranked perennially 49th or 50th in the United States on education. But what this ruling said was that in particular, we're doing a bad job of educating low-income students, Native American students, English language learners, and children with special education.
Now, I was reading your reporting and you cited that 34% of students, of kids living in the state are from an are living in poverty, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, another issue that was uncovered and is talked about more as we discuss child well-being in New Mexico is the CDC Kaiser study that you cited in your reporting from the late 1990s that really highlighted ACEs. Could you tell us a little bit about what ACEs is and how that impacts child well-being?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you asked that question because I think that ACEs is sort of having its moment, right? ACEs is adverse childhood experiences, and that study from the 1990s showed that people who as children had incidents like having a parent who was a drug user or an alcohol user, or who experienced child abuse, or who had a parent who was in jail, things like that can affect how their brain develops, which is a huge thing that will be impacting education. It affects their health as adults. It affects their ability to maintain a job. And so I think those are actually kind of intertwining because there's a lot of poverty, and poverty is one of those factors. So I think that more people are becoming aware of that. I think that there are people in the health system and in the education system that kind of know about that, but I think it's getting out more to the public, and I think the public needs to know about it. So even though they seem like two different things, like this ACEs, and children's exposure to ACEs is one thing, and our poor education system, they might seem different, but in many ways they affect each other.
And in your reporting, you talked about it. People that experience ACEs could be even more prone to substance abuse,
Yes.
to behavioral health issues, and other
teen
at-risk.
pregnancy and things like that. One thing that it sounds really sad, and it sounds like what do we even do about this? But the one thing that advocates say is that really one of the easiest ways, it's not a death sentence. You're not doomed to a terrible life because you have been exposed to ACEs. But one thing that does help is having an adult who you can turn to. And I think that so there are things that we can do to mitigate it. One thing is the educational system. There's an effort that has just started, and I've done some reporting on this here in Las Cruces, that is looking into how can we A, prevent ACEs, and B, mitigate the harm from these ACEs. And so that's being led by City Councilor Cassandra Gandara, with a whole bunch of people in the education and mental health and lawmaking community to really address this problem.
One thing that really struck me in your reporting was that as adults, we hear the saying a lot that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Mm-hmm. And we've often heard that, well, kids are resilient, or perhaps, a lot of adversity is good for kids. But the mental health professionals that you spoke with are really saying the opposite. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, it's there's an interesting documentary that I watched that called Paper Tigers, and they're like, you have a fight or flight response. Everybody has a fight or flight response, and when there's something bad happens, you either try to flee from it or you fight. What's happening to a lot of these children is that they're, it's pretty much as if the tiger is living in their home. Every day they're exposed to it. And that actually will affect their brain chemistry, and it'll affect how they react. Now, if somebody had everybody's going to run into adversity. That's absolutely true. But if you have somebody who's there to comfort you, that helps you to deal with that is an insulating factor, and that helps you. But if you don't have that, that's where you really start to get into the problems. And it's been shown to really affect how children learn, how they deal with their emotions. And that brings problems that go into the classroom, and that makes it difficult for teachers to teach. And it has a lot of after effects, for sure.
But it also seems, it's also difficult for people who are not involved with that or impacted by it, that they have to get over the stigma of it as well.
Yes, and you know what? That's a good point, because I think there is a tendency in New Mexico to say, well, this is a problem in all of our poor communities, right? And we do have a lot of poverty here, but ACEs is not confined to low-income neighborhoods. Drug abuse is not confined to low-income neighborhoods. In fact, some of the biggest drug turn-ins are on the East Mesa, which tends to have the reputation of being the nice part of town.
Here in Las Cruces.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a thing. And a lot of times there is a problem of stigma where people don't want to talk about it, because this is something you keep to yourself. So I think that there's a lot of complicating factors in trying to address this and try to make things better.
Well, one of the ways lawmakers and educators have been trying to address this is by expanding resources for early childhood education. Now, you did some reporting about what is happening here in Las Cruces. Could you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so last year I did a story on this effort. It's being led by this nonprofit agency called Engage. They put together an early childhood coalition that's really working to improve it. And part of it was just, the very first thing was just figuring out, like, where are we here in Doña Ana County on early childhood education. And so they sort of did a baseline study of who's got coverage, who doesn't, and so that was sort of their first step. And probably their first one was getting everybody together, which I think is a great thing. But so now they've kind of got a baseline, and they're looking at that. What's really positive is just recently Las Cruces Public School got its first New Mexico pre-K classes, and that's a really good step forward, because right now we've only had Head Start and New Mexico pre-K at private child care centers. So this is a really good step forward, I think. And that will really help, because there are studies showing that if you have New Mexico pre-K and you combine it with the expanded school year, it's called K3+, but it's essentially like another month of school, it erases that education gap between low-income students and regular students. And that is like a game changer for what, that could really help to solve some of the issues that were raised by the education lawsuit.
Real quick, I want to talk about Head Start. You mentioned that there may be, this kind of stereotype that Head Start is not getting the right teachers with the right credentials, but you found quite the opposite in Las Cruces.
In Las Cruces, for sure. Now, I think that this is in Las Cruces, all of the Head Start teachers, at least at LCPS, need to have a bachelor's degree. That's a requirement. And because they're in Las Cruces, they have a better chance of doing that. They're also in the public schools, which means they get paid the same as a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher. And so if you look at that, they're making, $36,000 to $40,000 a year. At a private preschool, they're making in the 20s. So it's a lot tougher for them to attract teachers. So they have that advantage, and that kind of makes it possible for them to do a really high quality program, because they do show that the more educated a teacher is, the better the results are for students.
Now, from the second largest city in the state to the rural areas, you hit the road and traveled to the eastern part of the state. You went to Roswell. Could you share with us what they're doing there and how they're meeting the challenge of early childhood education there?
Sure. Somebody tipped me off to Roswell because they said, there's just exciting things going on there. And I met a whole group of people that are just so passionate about putting together a really comprehensive plan. Like they see, they're a really isolated area. They're not that small. There are 48,000, there's 48,000 people in that community, which is fairly large for New Mexico. But there's a whole lot of nothing around it. And so it's really hard for them to get teachers, so it's tough for them to find college educated early childhood teachers. So they're looking to grow their own teachers. They're we're starting up a teacher training school at the high school. So they're we want our students to think about education as a future because it's really tough for them to get somebody from out of the area to teach there. Yeah.
How are they able to fund this? Because that could also be a challenge for many rural districts, and to meet the demands with the local funding and also the state funding and federal funding.
Yeah. So they're being really strategic about how they're putting money together, and they're probably a little further along even than Las Cruces Public Schools, because they've been looking at ways how do I take state money and federal money, put them in the same place so that I can offer more opportunities to our kids. And they've actually, the way they put it together, they're pretty close to an 80% preschool at their public school. We're nowhere near that here in Las Cruces. I think according to the Doña Ana County Coalition, it's maybe 30-some%. So they're far ahead of us, and that's a pretty good record.
Wow. Now you also went to the small community of Jal. Now tell us a little bit about that. It's a old ranching community. Now it's a oil boom area.
Yeah, it's an oil boom. There's man camps all over that place. So it's really, and I was driving down there and it was what is this traffic? So there's a lot of energy in that community. There's a lot of stuff going on. But the one thing that they don't have is that they're still a pretty small population. And so as much as they had all this going on, there was not one preschool in the entire town.
Seemed like there was a challenge for early childhood education, licensed childhood education there.
Yeah, there was none at all. So nothing existed in that community, and there's a lot of working folks there, and these people, they can't get any early childhood educators if it's so much easier to go work in the field. And so a lot of the teachers at Jal Elementary, and there's it's one school, one elementary, and one junior, senior high school. It's a pretty small community. And they were they kept getting phone calls saying, hey, is there any place that I can take my kid? And a teacher at the school was driving 30 miles each way to drop her kids off at a child care center. So they just decided, we should just do this. And so they had no idea exactly how that was going to go, and they didn't know how they were going to do it, but they went to the state and asked, hey, can we do this? And the first response was no. But pretty quickly they just had conversations, and they were they tried to figure out a way to make it happen, and they did do that. And so they immediately, as soon as they opened the doors to their preschool, they were completely loaded. 50 students in the first year, and they're in their first year. They're just finishing their first year, so it has been an unqualified success. And this actually is a really good model, I think, for small communities across New Mexico, because it shows that something like this, A, works, and B, fulfills a need that these communities might not have.
But what about funding, though? How's that formula working for them? Now, I know we just have a little bit over a minute left, so if you can kind of share with us about that.
Well, this is definitely a pilot type of thing. They're really trying it out because nothing like this has ever happened before. And what it is the Public Education Department and the Children, Youth, and Family Department essentially have funding that's mixed in this classroom, and they had to kind of make that work. And quite honestly, I don't know the secret sauce that they did that, but they did find a way. They found a way to make that happen.
Now, also, we don't have very much time, but now as you're able to step away from this and these stories develop, what are some of the things that you see that educators and districts may try to do? Is this something that you think they're going to look at, like places like Jal and Roswell?
Well, I think that those are really good models for people to look. I think the one thing to do is to see, for communities to see, like, what are the individual, or like what are the unique characteristics and things that we need to address, and then look at it as a whole. I think that that's the most successful. I think that's how they did in JAL. That's how they were looking at it in Roswell, and really how, you know, they hope to look at it here in Las Cruces. One thing I would say at Las Cruces Public Schools, we were talking about ACEs earlier, and they're looking at a community school model that kind of, and that's something that I'm working on right now, is addressing a lot of these things in a holistic way inside the school, right where the kids are. So I think that keeping kids in mind and then kind of really looking big picture is a great way to approach education in early childhood in New Mexico.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.